As we move into the 20th century, it's important to remember that while ideas have consequences, those consequences often take time to develop and become apparent. Sometimes decades pass before we can see the results. This happens because the initial generation that has an idea rarely takes it all the way to its logical conclusion. Consider the idea that humans are just animals. While that idea was first put forward by Darwin and earlier, they still continued to cling to their older traditions and to treat their fellow people as if there was something different about them. They didn't actually begin to treat humans like animals immediately. It takes a generation and into the 20th century before we start seeing things like forced abortions, forced sterilizations, and even eventually the Holocaust. That should teach us two things. First, it's helpful to judge ideas by their merit and their implications rather than just their immediate results. A new movement or approach that we see now and say, "See, nothing bad is happening," may just need more time before its full effects are felt. Second, even though we left Hegel, Marx, Darwin, and Nietzsche behind in our timeline decades ago, it's completely reasonable to expect their ideas to be holding sway here and even later. World War I has been called the Progressive War in America, so it's worth taking a moment to explain who the Progressives actually were. They were the political and cultural product of all that Enlightenment and Romantic idealization of science and worship of humanity. In the U.S., while there were political parties that called themselves progressive this or progressive that, it was more of a movement than a specific party. You could be a Republican progressive, a Democrat progressive, or something else. In the election of 1912, 75% of the votes cast were for someone calling themselves a progressive in some shape, form, or fashion. It was all based on this idea that humans were inherently good and that, using science, humans would eventually create a better world. Every day, in every way, the world was supposed to be gradually becoming a better and better place as the progressives applied the scientific method to solve problems. Eventually, they said, humans would create not just a better world, but a perfect one. One where there was literally no war, no crime, no poverty, and no sickness. As you might imagine, if you thought you could create this world, that all you had to do was work hard enough and you could have it, just think how you would feel. Progressives, therefore, were very, very active, very, very arrogant, and very, very optimistic. Their dedication to Darwinism also, incidentally, made them very, very racist. They believed that white Western culture was the most evolved on the planet, and so they saw it as their responsibility to help other cultures become quote-unquote better, whether they wanted to or not, especially African and Asian cultures. If you've ever heard of the idea of the white man's burden, this is it. White American and European progressives saw their culture as the best the world had to offer, and it was their responsibility to spread that culture to everyone else, because, at the point of a bayonet if needed. Now, Bible-believing Christians would have pointed out that none of this ever had a chance of working. Why? Because according to the Bible, humans have an inherent bent towards evil. They have a sin nature. So if you put unsaved humans together in a group, they won't get better and better, or at least not for long. In fact, they tend to get much, much worse. It's bad enough, they would say, when Christians who understand their sin natures get together. But for cultures that reject all of that and not fight against it is a disaster in the making. History seems to bear this out. The progressives would have scoffed at all of this. They inherited the idea from the Enlightenment that the Bible was fiction, and if that is so, then so was Adam. No Adam, no original sin. No original sin, no sin nature. The progressives looked at humans to be inherently good, and so therefore they thought the world around them would become inevitably better. If humans are good, then organizations made up of them are also good. This revolutionized people's view of government in the United States, and elsewhere too. Traditionally, Americans had regarded the government with fear and suspicion. They looked at it as a necessary evil, like a fire, and they were very worried about letting it get too big. A fire on a cold night and to cook your food is completely necessary. If it's cold enough, you can't live without it. But if the fire gets too big and escapes its hearth, it will burn your whole house down and kill you with it. So Americans had built lots of checks and balances around their governments to try to keep them contained, to try to keep them from becoming tyrannical. They didn't want the fire to escape. The progressives would have called all of this baloney. Humans are good, therefore human government is also good. What's more, government is the most efficient way to accomplish big social and political and cultural changes from the top down. And so the progressives became the first generation to introduce Americans to the idea of Big Brother government. While of course I use that also as a tongue-in-cheek reference to 1984, in this case it's supposed to be positive. Instead of a possible threat and a danger, the progressives taught that government was your friend and protector. You should give it more power over your life, not less. It's not a coincidence that the progressive period of American history saw voters disassembling one check and balance after another in order to make the government more and more powerful. And this was a worldwide process. All over the planet, governments were centralizing and promising a perfect world to their peoples. It's not hard to get excited about that. Which leads us to the very first of the great disappointments of the 20th century, the war we now know as World War I. At the time, it was simply called the Great War because, of course, no one knew a World War II was coming. This was the war that wasn't supposed to happen. On the view of the times, humans were inherently good and reasonable. Society had advanced to the point where no one would choose to take the step into insanity that would result in a major conflict. The world's economy was just too prosperous and too interconnected for people to want to fight another major war, and so surely people would choose diplomacy over insanity. Until suddenly the insanity won. It all began when a Serbian terrorist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie on June 28, 1914, as they traveled by open car through Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Ferdinand was the crown prince of the large but ailing Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they basically demanded that Serbia surrender their sovereignty to Austria in order for Austria to find the terrorists. The demands were so extreme that Serbia refused, and Austria-Hungary declared war. Well, unknown to anyone, Serbia had a secret treaty with Russia, and so Russia jumped in on Serbia's side. When that happened, a secret treaty that Austria-Hungary had with Germany brought them in on their side. France, a bitter enemy of Germany since their loss to Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War, jumped in on Russia's side when Germany entered. In order to take out France, Germany launched a massive invasion into neutral Belgium, which brought Britain into the war. Smaller nations piled on or stayed out depending on their leaders and particular alignments, and in short order, virtually every major empire in Europe and Asia was locked in one of the most brutal conflicts the world has ever seen. Germany tried to knock France out of the war quickly, but France and Britain met them and stopped them. Then both sides started trying to go around the end of the other, a movement called flanking in military terms. But doing so was so obvious that it never worked. Each side kept stopping and flanking, until soon there was a solid line of entrenchments stretching from the English Channel in the north all the way to the Swiss Alps in the south. A similar process was occurring in the east against Russia, though there the lines were spread further out. Over time, the armies dug in and added depth to their line so that even if the enemy took the first trench, their soldiers would just fall back to another and be ready to fight all over again. They dug them deeper and deeper to survive artillery attacks, and at some places they turned into pretty impressive affairs. The Central Powers were Germany, Austria, and Turkey, while the Allied powers were France, Britain, and Russia. It's important to note here that these were not the Nazis, though some people automatically assume they were. The Nazis will come later. One of the ideas that made Europeans so keen on getting to the war was that they thought it would be a short, glorious one. Everyone figured it would involve armies moving at a rapid pace, impressive battles would be fought, and capitals would fall. Everyone would be home in a few weeks or months with tales of daring do. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Science hadn't just advanced the world in positive ways. In fact, several developments in key technologies united to create a nightmare on the battlefield. Specifically, you had machine guns and other rapid-fire long-range rifles. These could spit out thousands of bullets a minute and mow down advancing troops. Another major development was non-line-of-sight artillery. Previously, the range of big guns was limited to where the person firing the gun could see. You had to be able to actually lay eyes on your enemy in the distance in order to have a chance to hit them. With the aid of advanced mathematics, new artillery could calculate how to hit targets a dozen miles away. That allowed armies to group hundreds of guns far in the rear and rain massive destruction on a broad space of ground with high explosive and gas-filled shells. Finally, the invention of barbed wire allowed armies to quickly set up huge and effective stops on enemy advances. Soldiers could go out and string up masses of wire literally overnight. Any enemy attack would have to stop and cut through it, and then they could be slaughtered. They put all three together for absolutely deadly effect. They would string the barbed wire at the farthest range of their machine guns and then sight their artillery in for the same place. When the attackers paused to cut through the barbed wire, they were shredded by the combined fire of artillery and the machine guns, and any that might have gotten through would face interlocking fields of machine gun and rifle fire all across a completely empty space called no man's land, where there was literally nothing but chewed up ground and thousands of dead bodies. The front quickly became a giant meat grinder for humanity. Worse, generals on both sides, particularly the British, didn't know how to deal with this new situation. They responded the traditional way by simply throwing more and more men into their attacks. If 1,000 wouldn't do it, well, what about 10,000? If not 10,000, maybe 100,000 running across all at once. Attack after attack went in and failed, and by the time they were done, virtually an entire generation of European men had been wiped out. And knowing this should give all quiet on the Western Front much more meaning. It is a brutal, if fictional, account of a German soldier's experience during the war, and it pulls no punches. The actual German title was Nothing New in the West, but the English translator changed it to a famous line from the British press that was repeated with increasing sarcasm by the soldiers during the war. Even when all was quiet, you could still be killed in an instant. The author, Erich Remarque, wants his readers to better understand the awful things that the war inflicted even on the survivors. Therefore, it is a straight-up story about the daily ordeals of soldiers in this, one of the most horrific of wars. You'll find that Remarque doesn't hold back. He wants you to really and deeply understand the torture and loss these men faced, as all of their hopes and dreams were taken from them one after another. While this is German, it accurately describes the experience that shaped an entire generation of Europeans. As they were on the losing side, it will affect Germany more than others, and it sets the stage for things to come, specifically for the rise of Hitler. Americans often wonder who in their right mind would elect someone like Hitler. A glimpse into the massive national trauma that happened just before his rise can give you an idea. As you read, be forewarned, like much 20th century literature, this is a book about finding out how badly misplaced the worship of humanity is. Humans are not inherently good, and they seem to excel at doing awful things to each other. To go from thinking that you will perfect the world to knowing the real depth of human depravity is truly awful. The result is a thoroughly depressing experience, not unlike reading a book about the similarly ill-fated Titanic. You begin with high hopes for humanity and science, only to see everyone die miserably by the end. And it's a useful and stark reminder about the realities of war, the worship of humanity, and blindly trusting the government. It spoke harshly against all of these things, and therefore it isn't a coincidence that when the Nazis began burning books and rearming Germany to take over Europe and the world, this was one of the first books they destroyed. For us, it's an important lesson that though war is sometimes unavoidable and necessary, it is never ultimately glorious or grand. Regard those who tell you differently with strong suspicion. America stayed out of the war for several years after it started. Most Americans looked at the horror as a purely European affair. Why should we get involved? They reasonably stated. Well, as one of the world's leading powers, it was unlikely that the U.S. could stay out forever. It would have to pick a side. Also, frankly, President Woodrow Wilson actually wanted to get the U.S. into it. Why in the world would he want that? Well, Wilson was, in many ways, the ultimate progressive, and he saw the war as a chance to fix everybody and to make the world safe for democracy, as they said at the time. From the time he was a child, through his career as a Harvard history professor, he had been planning on creating a perfect form of government and a perfect world order. The aftermath of a world war was the perfect time to put all of those plans into action. But how could he do that if the U.S. hadn't done his part? Who would listen to him? Well, Wilson got his wish because of several missteps on the part of the Central Powers. First, the Americans as a whole were already disposed towards helping the British, with whom they shared a cultural background and a common language. But then Germany began fighting using submarine warfare, and they sank several ships with Americans on board. True, those ships were also carrying war supplies, but the American public reacted angrily. Then the German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, was caught proposing an alliance to Mexico where, if Mexico attacked the United States, they could get back everything they had lost for the Mexican War in the 1840s. Mexico wasn't interested. They figured if Germany couldn't win a war on its own continent, how was it going to help them win one on a different one? But the Americans certainly were interested. Finally, when the Germans declared unrestricted submarine warfare, America declared war and joined in. Wilson ran the war along progressive lines. He wanted to build a certain kind of army that had only certain kinds of people in it. More importantly, it was billed as the war to end all wars and the war to make the world safe for democracy. We think of that as hyperbole and overstatement, but at the time, they literally meant it. They thought one more big war and we can create a perfect world where no war like this could ever happen again. It sets up an immense disappointment when, less than 20 years later, they're already locked in an even more destructive conflict with an even more evil enemy. To make a long story short, America entered the war just in time. British and French troops were on the verge of mutiny and surrender. The addition of fresh American armies, as unexperienced as they were, kept the Allies together. On the other hand, the Germans had just barely been holding it together, hoping to survive just a little longer than the British and the French. The entry of the Americans did them in. They lost hope and began to retreat. The Germans eventually sued for peace, looking to Woodrow Wilson and his 14 Points Peace Plan as their reasonable hope. The peace negotiations took place at the Palace of Versailles in France. This was Wilson's big chance to finally correct the world. His 14 Points Peace Plan was his answer. It was a progressive panacea that Wilson hoped would solve all the world's ills. Some of his ideas were naive and a little silly. Some were good, and of course, you'll have the opportunity to decide for yourself when you read them. We won't cover them all here, but there are several worth mentioning. First was freedom of the seas. Countries were supposed to be able to navigate anywhere in the world without harassment or competing claims. Next, he promoted the self-determination of nations. This seems like a good idea, and it is generally. For example, Serbia should have been able to determine its own fate without Austria telling it what to do. But it becomes more complex when we ask the question, well, exactly what is a nation and what do they get to determine? If one group inside a country declares itself to be a nation and wants to be independent from the larger group, who do we side with? If the state of Texas declares itself out of the U.S., for instance, and the U.S. says no, whose self-determination counts from the perspective of the international community? It will make for a messy application later on. He then called for free trade and competition worldwide, which is something that most free countries can get behind. He said that there should be no secret treaties or negotiations, and while that seems like a good idea, it was one of the sillier points. Because if the treaties and negotiations are secret, how do you actually even know if someone's doing it? How would you even know if everyone agrees? I mean, after all, isn't the point of a secret treaty to be, well, secret, and you're going to do it whether or not anybody is looking? Anyway. Finally, and most importantly, he called for the creation of a League of Nations where international disputes could be settled without resulting to war. You can think of this as kind of a forerunner of the modern-day United Nations. This was his most important and, in his view, most essential point. The British and the French, however, had a much more practical and cynical goal. They weren't interested in remaking the world. All they wanted to do was lock Germany down and punish them so hard that they would never be a threat to anyone again. Now, it's important to remember, again, that these aren't the Nazis we're talking about. What had Germany actually done that was any worse than any other major combatant? Nothing in particular. Lots of bad things had happened, but Germany was no more to blame for them than anybody else. And yet here they were being singled out for so much more punishment. Wilson sadly did not hold the line. Germany, who wasn't even invited to the negotiations, had trusted him to make sure that they were going to be treated fairly, but Wilson soon saw that if he wanted to get the League of Nations passed, he would have to give Britain and France what they wanted. So Germany was ordered to pay huge one-sided reparations from an economy already in shambles, and their once powerful military was locked down and limited to a humiliating state. They wouldn't be able to even defend themselves, let alone invade anyone else, even if they wanted to. This inflicted long-lasting and unfair hardship on the German people. Worse, it set up a situation of misery and economic pain that lasted for the next decade. When democratic government and playing by the rules failed to make their lives any better, the Germans turned to a popular Austrian former corporal who was promising to return Germany to greatness: Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party. Perhaps more importantly for the future, the horror of World War I played a major role in killing the idealistic Romantic movement that we saw from before the war. Romanticism and Enlightenment said that humans are basically good, and that if we give them free rein, things are just going to get better and better and better. Progress is inevitable, and science will save us all. Well, World War I acted like a giant wrecking ball to that worldview. Science had not saved us, and in fact had mainly seemed to make us more effective killing machines. The world order had barely survived, and large portions of the European continent had been laid waste. Literally millions of people had been killed and now lay rotting in no man's land. It was hugely disillusioning. And it would only get worse as the 20th century wore on. More disappointments were in line. In fact, there's good reason to really regard World War I and World War II as simply two parts of the same war. By the time both were over, there was little to no idealism left. In the words of British novelist William Golding, author of Lord of the Flies, "Before the Second World War, I believed in the perfectibility of social man, that a correct structure of society produced goodwill, and that, therefore, you could remove all social ills by a reorganization of society. It is possible that I believe something of the same again, but after the war, I did not because I was unable to." And men produce evil as a bee produces honey. But back in the U.S., things were, shall we say, a different flavor. Yes, there would be much existential dread, but the good times were rolling, and that gave people the illusion of meaning and significance. The U.S. hadn't suffered any of the destruction that Europe had. No battles were fought on its territory. It had joined the war later and only suffered a very small fraction of the losses that the Europeans did. And because of the war, its factories and economy were supercharged, resulting in a wave of economic prosperity that lasted throughout the 1920s. Good times made it easier to ignore the deeper crises that Europe had no choice but to confront. The result was a massive national party decade called the Roaring Twenties. Virtually every moral standard was questioned, and while much of it seems tame to us today, at the time it was massively controversial. This period saw the rise of Hollywood in movies, which began as silent films but soon moved into talkies that we know better. Jazz music made its debut, evolving largely from the African American subculture and outraging the staid Victorian ideals that came before it. Women were wearing less and less clothing, while sex and divorce became more and more open topics. Other new technologies made their appearance as well. The 20s were the first real decade of the automobile and the airplane. Radio began to spread across the country, and we saw the creation of national networks of stations, the ancestors of what people today call the, quote, mainstream media. These included ABC, CBS, and NBC. This was incredibly important because it allowed influential people in places like California and New York to reach virtually the entire country with these new progressive ideals in the form of movies, radio dramas, and reporting. It effectively made the world a much smaller place and subject to influence by a smaller number of people. Ironically, to a certain extent, this explosion of pleasure-seeking was itself a symptom of the larger collapse of meaning. In the aftermath of World War I in 1917, it became increasingly undeniable that the world was not a safer place, and that all the progressive romantic ideals about human nature were mere moonshine. Americans looked to money and pleasure to find their meaning. If the grand and high goals of creating a perfect world were gone, why not enjoy the good times while you have them? And that is one of the central themes of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, published in 1925. Humans are full of contradictions and contrasts that seem to make no sense to us, and this is one of them. Even while the 20s were roaring, more and more Americans were falling deeper and deeper into what's been called the Age of Despair. In fact, this group would come to be called the Lost Generation because they came of age at a time when it became increasingly clear that their world had lost meaning and value, and they had nothing to replace it with. As Nietzsche had observed, with God out of the picture, humans are left with nothing. Further, it was turning out that Nietzsche was wrong when he said that humans could be satisfied with whatever they chose to give meaning to. The Lost Generation were desperately trying it, and it simply wasn't working. The story of the novel focuses on Jay Gatsby, a self-made millionaire who seeks to reunite with Daisy Buchanan, the love of his life and the wife of another man. This takes place in the midst of a world of lavish parties and rampant materialism. I won't spoil the story, but let's just say that it doesn't work and that Gatsby's search for meaning in Daisy ends very badly. Despite the vast amount of wealth involved and the desperation on the actors in the drama, it all ends in utter nihilism and nothingness. It leaves no one satisfied. In many ways, the message of The Great Gatsby is very similar to All Quiet on the Western Front, though produced in a very different context. Remarque wrote his book to depict the despair of a generation from the midst of a humiliated and suffering Germany. We walk away with the conclusion that there is nothing in life but suffering and failure. Fitzgerald wrote his book in the middle of a booming United States, which has more money and goods than it has ever had before, and yet he comes away with a very similar conclusion. In many ways, this is the story of the 20th century in a nutshell.